The plan today, to the few faces that I see, is to engage you in thinking for the first hour or so. I will be honest, I have some like 50 plus slides. There's no way that I am ever going to get through them. I don't want to really lecture. I want to sort of think about these ideas together. And I'm going to be making an argument of why innovation by design is important, and that the kind of um, systematic thinking around mobilizing knowledge and applying it is actually, it's not a huge secret. It's not magic. It can be done. And there are ways to do it effectively. And so that's the overall arching argument that I'm going to make in the first hour and a bit. The second portion that we'll start when we come back from the break is we're going to do some just mind ideation exercises. I know it's late for some of you that start early, or early for some of you that start late. But it really does help, I find, at least getting older, that participating in fun activities where you get to think a little differently than your normal patterns, it actually, I find it invigorating. So I'm gonna go through the context really quickly, and it's sort of background for the argument. But you know, we live in unprecedented times. We're generating data and research at levels never before seen in history, although arguably that's always the case, except for maybe the Dark Ages. But even then, there were parts of humanity that were still learning, and it was just Europe that was dark. But the point is that we are actually seeing an exponential rise in publications of research, and fueled by, you know, machine learning, computing, communication, fueled by the omics revolution, our understanding of transcribing DNA backwards and forwards and folding and methylation and telomeres and things that nobody really paid much attention to 40 years ago. It's just becoming this huge machine of publication. Unfortunately, however, the application of that research lags behind somewhat. And it makes a little bit of sense. Knowing is not the same as doing, and not the same as being able to apply research. Knowledge, they say, is universal, but innovation is contextual. It's the same innovation that works in one place may not work in another place. For example, vaccines. A vaccine that needs to be refrigerated minus X degrees is very hard to keep in, let's say, a desert community or rural community where there is no refrigeration. So you can't necessarily have the same approach in vaccine distribution in different areas of the world. Also, a lot of the stuff we do is not reproducible. Some of it is because of the nature of the practice of science, but some of it is intentional. There are some researchers, clinician scientists that you might speak to once in a while when they're candidly off camera and not being quoted, that will tell you that in their experience, when they were doing their project, another researcher kept some pivotal information from them in doing the experiment, just so they couldn't get ahead faster than their lab. And I've heard a lot of those stories. Just, you figure it out. I'm not going to give you my secret sauce. I'm not going to stop you necessarily, but you're just a PhD student, and I'm applying for grants and I need this. And that happens. And the other argument is maybe having this valley of death between research and application isn't so bad, because from the business side of it, I've heard investors say, hey, if if ideas die and they're not ready and having like a natural selection process, I'm happy about that. I don't want to be investing in concepts that are not going to get off the ground, especially in health science, because it's so expensive and the pathway to market is so much longer than, let's say, an app. Why would I want to invest millions and millions and millions of dollars, billions if you were to believe some, when it's just going to flop? Recent promises in diagnostics, for example. But the counter argument to that is that good ideas also die. There are sometimes really good projects, but because they're complex or because they're new and regulatory systems don't understand, or people don't know how to necessarily navigate the system, they get delayed and shelved, and they don't actually allow us to leverage the investment we make into the research. So on the one hand, we sit at a time where the production of knowledge is unprecedented, exponential curve. On the other hand, we sit at a time where we have huge problems coming down the pipeline. Outside of a pandemic, aging populations, cost of healthcare delivery, shrinking tax bases, we need to innovate. We need to do stuff. And you hear it every day. Innovation is the way to success. That's our prosperity. There's this mantra. But what is innovation and how do we do it better? Is innovation this magic thing that we've been taught, that Edison comes up with an idea and bang, we have a light bulb? What is innovation? How do we do it better? So when we're going to start talking, or I've already started, but the way I'm going to look at this is that I'm going to make a little bit of a distinction between invention, which is more, tinkering and doing and contributing to research and knowledge in one direction, and innovation, which is sort of applying knowledge towards establishing an offering that's new or better. So invention is, by definition, has to be new. It's different. It's something that's disruptive, perhaps, if you want to put it in those terms. But an innovation can be just adapting a process or a way of doing something that improves efficiency at one end. And so it's incremental. And at the other end, it's what Christensen talks about in terms of being disruptive. So it creates its own market. It completely changes the way we do things, and so there are different ways to think about it. But for our purposes, the real question is, where did innovation come from? Like, it's great to have. We know we need to innovate. We know we need to do this well. So what? How can we, as a society, broadly speaking, or as educators, clinicians, researchers, students, people that get sick, how can we ensure that we can support with our meager tax dollars better ideas, better translation of research that will eventually, maybe in our lifetimes, help us feel better? So I guess the question is that I want to pose to you is, what drives innovation? And can we predict where innovations will come from or how successful they might be? These are not easy questions if you think about it, because if you're able to predict innovation, there goes the whole creative, humanist, individual, inspired by something innovator alone theory. Then you have to start looking at trends and parallel developments. So innovation can come from anywhere. And let's talk about what actually drives innovation. And so what I want to sort of cover over the next 30 minutes, I guess, at most, is a sense of where do these products come from? What are some of the methods around making it more systematic? And how can we find where the good ideas are coming from? Any questions before I move on? Seeing none. Okay, everyone's really, really mellow and quiet, nothing. Okay, I see one or two smiles, so maybe I'm not boring everyone yet. Okay, I want you to think about this quote, because I've heard it and it's bugged me for many years. I don't think that Ford actually said this, but it's attributed to Ford. And the argument that he had, or it maintains, is this: that we don't need to ask patients about what they want or what they need, because patients don't know. We are privileged investigators, innovators, clinicians, researchers, scientists. We know better what someone with breast cancer needs or wants. And it's our job to tell them so. So much so that I've in the past talked to people where they have proposed at one point a few years back that ketogenic diets were the way to go for women with breast cancer undergoing chemotherapy. And I was just looking at these, and in this case, it was a man, and I'm thinking, how can you just stand there and tell me that you're going to tell women that they need to diet when they're undergoing chemotherapy and you know better what they need and what they want? And it was just this sort of cathartic moment that we don't necessarily know better. And Henry Ford, this quote, I would argue, is very, very wrong. And it's a rhetorical fallacy, because what he's doing is he's substituting the needs that people have to what they think they want. At the time, if you think about it, the 19th century, late 19th century, is a time of huge industrialization across America. What is happening? America is very different in some ways than Europe. It doesn't have roadways across the continent. It doesn't have an easy way to cross the continent, but there's definitely this need, a very, very strong need of being able to travel, to connect places short and long term. That's why we have the building of the railroad, 1870s. This is literally people, and actually, if you look at the pictures, very marginalized and very particular types of people being forced into building a system that can solve the need for fast, cheap travel across North America. And in addition to this need, there is also a need for stuff outside of the rails. So yes, it's great that we're building this railroad from one side of the country to the other in America and in Canada, but it doesn't actually solve some of the needs for faster travel. So it's not that they wanted faster horses. I would argue that at this time, people didn't really want faster horses. The need was for some form of reliable transportation, something that was economical, accessible, that you could control more than horses. There's a reason why railroads are being built, where people are experimenting with airships at this time, why people are trying to jump off bridges with wings like they're birds, because there is definitely this underlying need across many countries at this point for ways of getting around that are efficient. Okay, does that make sense? So let's look at the MP3 player. Here is mine. This was one of an earlier version, but late 90s, middle 1990s, there is all of the sudden these gadgets. All of the sudden, sorry, that shouldn't be Ford. That's not, my apologies, that's not Harry Ford, that's Steve Jobs. There are all these gadgets that are hitting the markets, and they're really a response to digital media. So since the 70s even, we have Laserdisc, we have CDs, DVDs, all of the media is going into a format that is easy to copy, which is a problem, that is not necessarily easier to distribute until you get to this MP3 player state in the 90s with, you know, this thing called ARPANET, but they renamed it into internet. And all of a sudden, you have these devices now that can store multiple CDs and play, and all you have to do is connect to this ARPANET internet thing and download stuff, and it'll play them on rechargeable batteries. Toshiba is making them. Sony is making them. They are following in line with what people understand is the way to consume music. But what is the real need here? If you start thinking about it, the genius that I would attribute to Steve Jobs is not that he was able to create a simple iPod player. I believe this one is a few buttons, and it was more simple than the Sony Walkman, more simple than a CD player that has 4 or 5 buttons, and you have to put things in and take out. It's relatively simple. The real genius is recognizing something else. At this time, there was a lot of stuff going on around the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, preserving digital rights to media, understanding how do you distribute rights. More importantly, up until this time, when you distributed music or media and you recorded it on magnetic tapes, VHS tapes, the ones in Walkmans, they degraded. You couldn't copy them over and over again, and so at some point you had to go back and buy the media again. With CDs and DVDs and with digital media players, there's no or very minor degradation. So what you really have now is not just a need to play music in a different way. That you already have on the market. The real need is to be able to control consumers and control the rights to the media that they have on their devices. So the real need is actually not just consumption, but it's a way of compensating producers. It's a way of thinking about enforcement and distribution. That's what the iPod revolution represented, I would argue. It's the ability not to make another player that at that time was almost a decade into similar devices. It was understanding that there was a need for an ecosystem, for a way to distribute and download. See, with this system, I had to go on Napster or some other file sharing system to get my media. And not only was that inconvenient because it was potentially illegal, and you didn't know what you were getting, and it was a hassle, but sometimes it took time to download. Now I could buy my iPod and I could go officially for 99 cents and download my music. More importantly, people that produce the content could get paid. Recognizing that need was what I'm arguing is the real genius. So what is a need? So understanding needs is really not easy. We talk about, innovating, finding unmet needs. In Maslow's definition, there's a hierarchy. There's some needs that are by far more significant and more important. Needs for shelter, needs for food outweigh needs for self-actualization or self-esteem. So being able to understand, go out into context and talk to people who have those needs, to be able to understand what those needs are, and then be able to systematically design an intervention that meets those needs, that is better or newer than what exists. That is a systematic approach to mobilizing knowledge, to innovation. So a need is something that inspires action. The depth of that need, how intense it is how much value that you can potentially bring. So when you find an unmet need and it's just, I could live without it, it's okay, that's not necessarily going to translate into a really sort of strong motivation to adopt something new. Of course, there are different types of needs. There's desires, wishes, instrumental, foundational. All of these things are things we can talk about. But what I want to talk about actually is how this sort of works in our thinking about innovation and why it's important to start at the need, to start with people, with patients, with physicians, with the people that you're working with, because they're the ones that can help set the priorities and the thinking. Remember, those of you that joined earlier, we were talking about being in a cognitive rut, learning something, and your brain allows you to execute it in particular ways. So if you approach a problem from the way that you see the world, you're going to come up with the kinds of things you already know. So it's really important when you go out, contextually engage with people and whoever the stakeholders are, that you learn from them, that you try and understand them without imposing your own personal biases onto them. So this sort of is the relationship where we start by going out and finding what is the current state, what's going on, where are the gaps for people in a hospital, in a community center, at home. What would people, where would do they want, what did they need in that space that's not being delivered for or not being catered to? Where are the gaps in either products or policy? Where are the opportunities for improvement? What's unmet? Now, this could be met by a technology, it could be met by a policy, it could be met by a process, a protocol. There are different ways to approach these kinds of problems, but starting out, identifying a solid need will help you shape the direction of the innovation. Even if you are starting with research that you already have in your lab, that you've developed, going back to the stakeholders and making sure, verifying where their priorities are, is going to impact how you develop that knowledge, how you tweak it into an innovation, And more importantly, you also then have buy-in from your ultimate user or customer, or whatever you want to call that individual, because now you have somebody that can advocate and can tell you before you spend $1 billion that that's a good idea. So as we look at needs, we then discover gaps and barriers that create those needs, and they're usually caused by problems in the system or in sort of our delivery, and those then become opportunities for interventions that move us along towards future states and desired state, which is the ultimate outcomes of better health that we're looking for. So what I'm suggesting is that this way of looking at innovation, not just as a miraculous thing that just happens, but as a systematic approach of understanding where we have opportunities, where we have research, where there are gaps, and which gaps we can fill and plan, is really this plan or process for systematic development, evaluation, and validation. And that is actually the definition of design. So when I hear design thinking, I want to differentiate. There are two types of design thinking. There is the design thinking that is the capital D, capital T, the proprietary way that IDEO and the D School in Stanford came up with their 5-step process, which, to be honest, I am a product of, and it's part of my cognitive bias. But since I've been involved in health and health-related design, I've learned that that kind of capital D, capital T design thinking doesn't work. It doesn't pay attention to ethics. It doesn't pay attention to regulatory limitations and processes within the health innovation system. The first step of that process is empathy. Well, it's great if you go to a mall and you empathize with your cell phone user. You can do that. You cannot go into an ICU and empathize with people on respirators, because there are issues involved in not only getting access, but introducing potential germs, et cetera, et cetera. So the way that you think about it doesn't necessarily follow that. But the small d, the planning process and systematic thinking, is absolutely the way that we should be thinking about innovation. And so at the Ideation Clinic, our organized system of thinking about innovation focuses on early stage ideation, and we call it the innovation key. And it looks at the process of identifying your purpose, where you want to go, what you want to do, and then exploring the needs around in an iterative fashion. And part of that that innovation key that I want to sort of talk briefly about for the next 10 minutes, because it's something that we'll jump into at the second portion, is ideation. So the way that I am using ideation is as a process that is different than brainstorming. The big difference in the process of ideation that I'm talking about is that ideation involves 3 sort of key sub-steps. The first one involves generating ideas. It's absolutely crucial to generate ideas, and that's what brainstorming is about. And you want volume, and you want different strategies. And in the next session, we'll take an approach to try and generate ideas. You do not have to qualify these ideas. You don't have to assess them. The goal is to come up with the most ridiculous, broadest, greatest number of ideas. Why? Because ideation isn't really about the ideas themselves. It is about a systematic process of vetting those ideas so that we can select the ones that are most appropriate to address our unmet needs. So once you have hopefully a pool of 50 or 100 ideas, you then start systematically categorizing them, putting them together, approaching them sort of in a way where you can break them apart, put them back together. So there are strategies of thinking about ideas and problems where you can add different ideas, rearrange them, look at broader contexts, frame them. So there are a number of ways that you can regroup them and then prioritize them so that you go from 50 completely maybe ridiculous, unqualified, nonsensical ideas to 10 or 15 ideas that may have some germs of something good. And then you start prioritizing them and selecting them systematically with stakeholders, with other people, so that you can whittle those down and evaluate them one idea at a time. And that's the real key of an ideation process, is you want to start big with lots and lots of stuff, but at the end, you want to be able to whittle down the ideas to ones that are testable and be able in some way to test them with various stakeholders. Make sure that you understand the regulatory processes if it's a drug. Make sure that you understand what you might need to do for policy. Make sure that you meet with the nurses or the family patient advocates that are going to be involved in the decision-making process, so you understand where the barriers might be moving forward with those ideas. So the purpose of ideation, or to ideate as the way that we define it, is to generate testable ideas. That's the real key. It's very much like the scientific process. It's not a eureka aha moment. It's not a, oh my God, I now know what I'm going to do in healthcare. And it's not a, I'm going to randomly throw these compounds at these sick people and see what happens. There is a process involved. Ideation is not brainstorming. It is not a free-for-all. It is most effective when it's structured and when you start understanding the selection criteria and applying it to a particular context or space. So I'm going to briefly just go through one example. Now, there are different ways to evaluate winning ideas, and every team, every context will have lots of different ones. My students in my class have gone on the internet. Very happy the internet exists. You can find out 10 different ways to approach verifying, validating, evaluating. So these are just some of the metrics, by no means any authoritative, but in selecting ideas, you can look at value, how much effort it will take to get something off the ground versus how much investment you have to make. So if you're, and the ultimate benefit, if the benefit is going to be really huge, it's life-saving, there becomes more value, more potential in that innovation. You can look at it through the lens of who's on your team, who do you have access to. If one of the mistakes I often hear about or see is people want to innovate with patient X, but they can't find a patient X or have no access to that patient X. Well, then you can't probably innovate because your team doesn't include the skill set and the insights that you'll need to do that job unless you figure out how to access it. Costs. Let's be honest, no matter what, you need to figure out, is this viable or sustainable? Now, it doesn't not necessarily mean, and when I talk about innovation or translation or knowledge mobilization, it does not always result in commercializable stuff. Policies don't necessarily commercialize. There are ways to make little tiny changes in the process of the way we do things that may save the system a lot of money, but not actually make anyone rich. Personally, my vantage point is that's okay. That's still innovation. You're still making a difference. And there are now business models actually that take that into account. So sort of value-based healthcare is this approach where you as a company can go to a hospital and say, let's work on this problem, and if we can save you $10 million over the next X years, you'll share a portion of that with us. And so that's a different way of thinking about innovation. And then, of course, the alignment, the demand, your personal goals, your passion. Doing something you hate, even though it may be innovative, at the end of the day will be horrible. The other thing to consider are champions. Quite often, especially in healthcare, having people that can open up doors for you, that can give you access, is absolutely fundamental for the process of innovating. If you can't get into hospitals, and I've seen this, and unfortunately it's a big issue in our context in Canada, actually, because we have 10 jurisdictions and I don't know how many sub-jurisdictions and sub-jurisdictions in hospitals that make decisions, and how accessing purchasers or people that are early adopters becomes very complicated, and sometimes in our system, whereas in places like America, because they're sort of more money driven and they see people's lives as balance sheet numbers, sometimes saving an insurance company a buck or two is very easily received. And we've had experiences here where an innovation, and I'm going to use Sunnybrook as an example, the innovation developed at Sunnybrook couldn't get any traction at all in Canada, but managed to secure, I think, what was it, 5 or 6 hospitals right away in the States once they demonstrated what they were doing. So having champions especially is very important. So generally what you're seeing is just one way that I've summarized all of that into a way to prioritize ideas. So once you generate a lot of ideas, being able to systematically score them, and this is by no means the only way to do it, but pull out the better ones based on what you're looking for, so that you can then go on and more likely succeed in your prototyping stages. So as you start spending more time and money, the outcomes of failure become more and more expensive. So you really want to start with the strongest ideas that you can muster in the beginning, and keep verifying them and validating them as you go. So at the ideation clinic, that process we see as sort of the ideation key. And that is all I'm going to do, so that I can take some questions and discussion, and if anyone wants to talk. Just jump right in, unmute yourselves. I think you can do that. Any thoughts, comments? Nobody has any thoughts. This is horrible.
This wouldn't be a very good ideation, eh? Question, it's Linda. I'm from Sinai Health. I work in IT actually at Circle of Care. So my question is, in terms of this ideation, creating that huge, that first generation of this huge amount of things, do you do that obviously with some of the people that ultimately will be involved, or do you keep it really broad to start and then hone it down as you select and get to the evaluation state?
So that really depends on the nature of the project to some degree. So, and we would have to sort of roll it back a little bit. So before we would start an ideation session, we'd have to have some basic requirements and constraints.
Right. Like
So
an opportunity, like the business, like that sort of has already been done. And then you ideate on that opportunity or need, right?
right.
Okay.
And you go as ridiculous as possible.
Okay.
So some of the guidelines for brainstorming that we talk about is encourage wild ideas. Don't judge. It doesn't matter what the idea is, because someone might scream out an idea, or hopefully not scream, but contribute an idea that you think is really, really bad. But if you shut it down, then you're shutting down whatever that idea triggers in somebody else's mind, which might be very different and might actually contribute. I had the pleasure of talking about this with a former VP of Intel. And he said towards the end of his career, one of the ways that he would evaluate if someone came up to him with an idea was if he thought it was a good idea, then he was going to just say no right away. If he wanted to say no right away, then he would think about it, because he was convinced that then maybe there's something different there. Because if his gut reaction from his experience was, no, that can't work, then he has to give it more thought. So in the brainstorming session, you don't want to shut down ideas that you think won't work, because you don't know where they will lead.
And just quick question, the selected, and when you get into selection, obviously that's a group, a predestined group that will help hone down the viable selected ideas to move forward, right?
Yeah, so you have to have a selection process. So, and this is where part of it can be based on cost. It's great to talk about fiber optic cabling, but if you can't afford it, it's not a viable idea. So you whittle down what is, or what pieces might be possible, based on, but it has, part of what I'm advocating is that it has to be systematic. You can't just say, oh, that's a bad idea. No, okay, what's our criteria for judging what might or might not be a good idea? Once you do that, you can also prioritize the ideas. And then if you have top three, or pieces of top three. So one idea may actually be a piece that works with another idea. So when you categorize and you smush them together, that's part of the importance of having a lot of these, because then you can see trends or areas that might be useful for solving the need.
Joseph, it's Pat. Can you hear me?
Very well, thank you.
So great presentation. I mean, I'm curious. This is probably a little bit more sort of philosophical. Thinking about cultures of innovation, and I know it's not specifically what you've talked about so far, but I think about, you know, kind of the more pure sort of, you know, kind of innovation mentality, and you know, talking as you have about an environment where people are free to come together, to ideate, to think about, you know, to build, to grow. You have some mechanism to sort of evaluate and then make some decisions about sort of what's left and what you're going to go forward with. Coming back to sort of healthcare, and you know, I wonder what your thoughts are about how you do that in a remarkably resource constrained, you know, kind of business where core business is broken bones and you know, bleeding blood vessels and it I mean, just sort of conceptually, there just isn't that, you know, let's all sit around the table Google style and you know, on our bouncing balls and beanbag chairs. I'm not being disrespectful to that environment, but pointing that out to contrast it. How do you think about building cultures of innovation within sort of healthcare in general, as long-term care, acute care. How do you think about building that within the walls, bringing industry, bringing partners to the table? Like, do you have some thoughts about how you create that? Because that's not in the DNA.
Yes, cheaply. So look, there is this subtext here, actually. There's a reason why the evaluation and selection, even in this process, is singled out and split apart. Because it's been my experience in our spaces, healthcare professionals are taught to think systematically and linearly about evaluating processes. So they want to evaluate right away. They want to only look at what's realistic and what's doable or possible, which is the antithesis of where you want to start. Part of the challenge in innovating, first of all, is finding time. So right now it's very hard to involve people in finding time that are clinicians, for example. Although some of them are doing it out of necessity because they have to be thinking around these things, and they're seeing the unmet needs very clearly, and all of a sudden, okay, a trial and error, let's do this. We need to fix this, otherwise we just can't move forward. But to do so intentionally does require a certain amount of space, and space where you can generate ideas. It is not, it's constrained. It's not airy-fairy in the way that, and again, this is my reaction to design thinking, because that's sort of, let's blue sky it and go to some other country to observe and empathize. What I'm saying is, we have these requirements, we have this identified program. We're going to spend 20 minutes without criticizing one another, without thinking about what's impossible. That's the number one thing that usually people start out with. That can't be done. And try spending 10 minutes with your peers and coming up with any kind of idea. It's very hard because you have to be in that kind of mind space, and there are people that can facilitate this. So taking an hour or two, you have to do it. That's if you're going to be intentional, and that's where you can invite industry. That's where you can make some of the bonds in these initial stages. Actually, if you make that interaction fun, you're actually investing in a lightweight system before you get to the prototyping, the trials, the evidence generation. So how do you do that? This comes down to champions, intent, and having a champion that will carve out space for you and your group. But it doesn't have to be, you don't have to start with all or nothing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I like that, and we're. I mean, I think healthcare is very, very stuck and very rigid for the most part. So, yeah, it's a good thought.
It's so, as part of this, when we talk about more in depth in some of the processes, one of the key elements I think in the needs discovery is to unlearn. The hardest part is to acknowledge that you are not the expert on the patient experience. And
yeah,
that, I think, is, you want to talk about culture of innovation, letting go and acknowledging that you may not know everything, which is what we're expected. We're expected as clinicians, scholars, researchers to know the answer, or at least deliver some educated pontification of what we think will be the answer. It's really hard to say, well, I don't know, I'm going to ask others.
And perish the thought, but bring actual patients and families to the table, and and not like the clever way we do it in terms of screening them so that they're like us. Anyway, that's a whole different rant, but yes.
So yeah, in a couple weeks, I'm doing a session with some PGY3s on the importance of engaging with patients. And you're absolutely right. And it's not just patients, though.
Yeah.
A musician, bringing a musician to your ideation session, bringing people to think differently, bringing, there's I was asked last year, well, what are you doing in your program about EDI? Why don't you have specific EDI criteria? Well, that's because it's in creativity and innovation. If you don't have different points of view built in, you're not doing it right. You should be thinking about diversity. You should be encouraging diversity of thought, diversity of perspective, opinion, because you don't know where that next idea is going to come from that's going to be really different.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ian?
Yeah, go ahead, Ian. Sorry, we can't hear you.
I think you're still muted. I'm sorry.
No, we still can't hear you. You no, can you hear Ian, Joseph?
No, I cannot.
Okay, no, so we can't hear you. I think your mic is not working because you're not muted.
No.
Do you want to type in your question?
So actually, Pat, I don't know if you can, while we're waiting for the question, I don't know if you have time to join us later, but what I'll show is like a relatively quick 20-30 minute exercise that I've done before that just, if you just participate, can get you thinking around different ways of generating concepts.
Regrettably, Joseph, I'm on borrowed time, so I'm going to drop out momentarily.
Well,
sorry.
No, it's perfectly okay. But that is, to your point, the tough part of creating a culture when there's so many other pulls on your time and responsibilities.
Yeah. So it sounds like the perfect time to bail then, just when we're getting to stuff that I really need to know. Yeah. Gotta love healthcare.
How can we find a good ideation that match the need of the patient? Well, so how do you find a good idea that match? So that's the evaluation part. So once you have an idea that your group has developed, you have to go back and validate it with the people that have that need. Does this make sense to you? What do you think of this? If we were to do it this way, what can you imagine would be good or bad about it? And so at the stage of this kind of evaluation, you're just presenting a very loose concept, but there still may be enough there where people will say, no, that doesn't work for me. So to give an example of a researcher that I know that went through this, in regenerative medicine. So she has a lab, and a few years back, she was working on the problem of spinal cord injury, as it so happens, and how do you regenerate injuries to spinal cords. And her lab had been working on these problems since she started, and Canada Research Chair, and they very successful, getting lots of grants, very early stage basic science, regenerative medicine. At one point, she told this story to me. They actually went out and started meeting with some of the patients, just for laughs, I guess, to talk about the research and to get some feedback and thoughts. And what they found was once they started engaging the patients, the people they were talking to started saying, well, why are you doing that? And she's like, what are you talking about? Well, you know, we're going to regenerate the spinal cord and enable you to walk. And some of the patients said, well, that's great and dandy. And I can't wait for you to do that. But you know what I'd want tomorrow? To be able to pee on my own and to be able to have control over my bodily functions. And she hadn't actually, as she told me the story, really thought about it that way. That a bigger priority from the patient side was this different problem, not the whole regeneration of the spinal cord, but regenerating particular aspects of functionality. And so that changed the direction of her research and her lab, because now the problem changed. Her end goal is still the same in the grand scheme of things, but she's looking at one particular pathway right now because that, first of all, she thinks it's productive, and it may be an easier problem to address through her research than 100% regeneration. So my point is going back and checking with the people you're working for and asking them, do you think this is a good idea? Do you it can send you in a direction that you didn't think about.
But doing that in the first place, the better idea, like before generating the idea, by asking the patients what they really want in the first place before you generate all the thoughts, will that be a more efficient way?
So personally, I absolutely think that's where you should be starting all the time. So contextual inquiry. So it's not about, oh, I know where the problem is and I'm going to solve it now. It's more about, I'm going to go out into this context. We know there's a problem here. We're going to observe and try to understand it. We're going to look at how people are working in that space, what is happening in that space, talk to the people in that space to try and understand either the workflows, the systems, the cultural backgrounds, the perceptions, and that will help you identify unmet needs. It's those needs that you can then look at, well, how do we then address them? Where are the problems? Where are the gaps? And how do we sort of create our interventions that will speak to those specific gaps?
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Joseph. If I may add quickly something here, Joseph, is I think you touched upon a very important topic, which is the critical investigative phase of the ideation and looking at the needs. I think this is the most vital component, as you described, in the design thinking process. And it's where the carefully formulated questions reveal themselves as a great way to approach the design problem, even before innovators or designers start actually designing or working on developing the solution. So, as they say, I think great questions lead to great design. So, to make a better design a new better solution, I think you need to take the time to ask the questions, to kind of reveal opportunities, to validate the idea, to understand, what is the real problem here? What is or understand even the user context? And I think one of the things that is really important here is asking the good questions, or, questions that could, for example, challenge assumptions, or questions that can cause the innovator to stretch and think about the bigger picture. So, for example, a good question doesn't just depend on the type of question it is, but also on how you frame the question, how you frame the problem as well. So I think these are all very important points that you touched upon early and are very essential early on in the process of innovation.
So I want to make it really clear, the piece that I've been talking about is this ideate piece. In terms of the key, it actually comes sort of in our process after we're identifying the purpose and the populations, and it comes after we explore the needs. So it's actually significantly down the road, and then after framing the requirements, the environment, the resources, then you start ideating. At that point, it assumes that you've already sort of identified a solid need within the context, that you've identified what your team and resources are, and you frame to some degree what the problem is.
Thank you, Joseph. Greg, you have a question?
Yeah, it was just a comment more. I feel like when Joseph was explaining that example of the regenerative medicine researchers trying to repair the spine, realizing that maybe they could switch their work, I feel like it was kind of presented in a way that, like, those two ideas are not mutually exclusive. You can have people that dream big, that want to do the regenerative medicine research that might only be effective in 30, 40 years. And at the same time, you can have people working on the bodily needs of the person tomorrow. So I guess it's important to have both, and I just felt that it maybe wasn't framed that way, even though it's obvious. There must be sort of room for people that are bigger thinkers in this space as well.
So I'll say I don't think it is obvious. So, you know, the bigger thinker that I'm talking about, she's a mentor of mine, and she's an incredible thinker, but it didn't occur to her that there are maybe intermediate steps that she could be looking at until she started talking to patients. So I'm not saying that she abandoned her other work. She just refined her approach in her research, and developed a slightly different direction with some of her students. It's not that, you know, she's abandoned the overall goal, but the thinking changed.
Right. No, that makes sense.
And it's actually, I know that, you know, we have a limited time, so it's hard to encapsulate everything, but what I'm showing is the understanding, and I don't know if you can see my cursor. I don't think you can necessarily, but the point is that the unmet needs have a number of gaps and problems and barriers that potentially are what's keeping you from the overall outcomes. So in health science terms, you have different endpoints that may lead you forward to some future state, but doesn't solve the overall problem, but you're breaking it down into pieces. And you may be able to tackle different pieces at different times, and different people might tackle different pieces.
This could maybe change the way you allocate your resources percentage-wise. Yeah, makes sense.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Joseph, for such an incredible and very insightful talk. It's 5:42 now, so why don't we take a break until 6 o'clock? Is that okay with you, Joseph? And then resume the workshop? Okay. So yeah, let's take a 17-minute break and then come back at 6 o'clock to resume the workshop. Thank you again, Joseph, and thank you again, everyone, for joining.
Thank you, everyone. I'll stick around for a few minutes in case anyone wants to ask any questions, and then, yeah, then take a bit of a break.